Hello and good day. This is the first lecture on the chapter of social class in the United States. It is kind of a continuation of the last chapter. The last chapter was global stratification, which was, if you'll remember, was about the layering of groups of people all over the world and the different systems of layering. So there was slavery or a state system or caste system. This chapter is exclusively about the social class system, which is the form of social economic stratification that we use here, that characterizes the United States. Some chapters, some textbooks actually put these two topics together, and that makes for tons of material because there certainly is overlap. So some of the things that I'll talk about in these videos are going to sound a little repetitive, and that's kind of why. I elected to take them apart because there is so much material, and to be perfectly honest, this is my favorite sociological topic, and I could talk about it, like I could talk about it all semester. So let's begin by defining what we mean by social class. The same way, and remember, we're talking about layers of people. We're not talking about individuals. There's no such thing as the individual. So when we were discussing a state or when we were discussing caste, they were groups of people who ranked relatively close to each other on things like status and influence and public regard. This class is the same, except this one is based on economic resources. It's not, while there is, I want to say it's not determined at birth, because certainly your class is determined at birth, but it's based on economic resources. We're going to talk a lot about the Marx. Well, we'll talk about Marx and Weber, but for our purposes, I want to think about class as having these three distinctive elements. Well, they're related, but they're different, which is property, right? And property for our purposes is going to refer to the resources that generate wealth and income. Wealth, now there's two ways to think about wealth. Your textbook defines wealth as the value of your property minus your debts, or sometimes we talk about that's your net worth, right? That's what you're worth after you liquidate all of your resources and pay all of your debts. Another way to think about wealth is it is the property that generates income. Matter of fact, that's the term in other textbooks. That's the definition of wealth. So it would be your houses or your stocks or your factories or your farms or your breeding puppies, whatever generates wealth. The most common kinds of wealth that we have in the United States is your home, because your home is people buy it and they sell it for a profit and they buy another. But yet, what's one of the trends that's happened in the United States is fewer and fewer people even own their home, right? Your wealth is influenced by how fully employed you've been or not, the duration of your unemployment. It's influenced. These are predictors, but they're no guarantees by how much college education you have, because theoretically more educational attainment is supposed to predict more income and inheritance. The chart here illustrates, this illustrates income. Income is defined as the cash that is generated from your property, right? So your property could be your houses, could be your stock markets, but the rent that comes from your property or the interest that comes from your stock markets, from the stock market, that is your income, right? People can have a lot of income and have no wealth because they can owe more than they're generating. They can also have a lot of wealth and no income. For instance, I think it's one of the Bill Gates, right? That the way he set up his foundation, he owns a tremendous amount of stock options, but the interest or the what's earned from that goes right back into it. So he has very little income, right? So income is cash, wealth is like your stuff. What has happened in the last 50 years is we've seen a decline in inequality and then an increase. And that is illustrated here in this picture. So this is the top but the top 25%, the bottom 5% over the course of 1928 over to 2007. And what's happened is, what's the annual US income for the top 1%? And what you see is in the the annual income in the top, annual US income share of the top. Okay. What's happened was, that's right, that's what it illustrates, is that in the 20s and the 30s, the top 1% earned a larger percentage of all of the money made. And then we moved through the 70s and the 60s and the 70s, and income inequality declined, and their relative earnings began to decline. And then we come out of the 70s into the 80s, into the Reagan and the Bush and the rapid expansion of the Clinton years. And now the relative rate of earnings of the top 1% is increased. And this trend, so this is dated 2007, has actually only gotten worse. The income inequality in the United States is considered the most radical inequality almost in American history. The gap between the owners, if you will, between the highest paid people and the lowest paid people has gotten larger and larger. What I have on this slide is different ways of thinking about that income inequality. And I'm going to share a couple videos that give you other ways. It is such a radical gap between a average median referring to half make more and half make less, and the very, very wealthy. It's difficult to comprehend. It's difficult to really try it for people to illustrate it in a way that makes any sense. So what I've tried to do here is giving you lots of different ways of thinking about what is meant by the unequal distribution of property or income or wealth, right? So the one on the what do they call those? The infographic on the right is what the CEO makes, number of hours a full-time minimum wage employee of the organization would need to work to equal 1 hour of the CEO. So over here you have the CEO of Walmart, right? Their minimum wage worker would need to work 1,300 hours to make the wage that their CEO earns in 1 hour, right? You have the Durden restaurants. I believe this is like a restaurant chain. This is, I think Chili's and Red Lobster, things like that. 421 hours. Of T-Mobile, 580 hours. Of Kellogg, this is their minimum wage worker would need to work 528 hours. I'm going to talk maybe at some point about the minimum wage versus a living wage, and why people advocate for raising the minimum wage. There's actually a history to that. Some of these other ways of thinking about it. So when people talk about the 1%, and I've tried various ways to illustrate this in a classroom, but imagine if you had a room of 100 people and one person, okay, you have 100 people and everyone has one box of chocolates, right? That would be an even distribution of the wealth, an even distribution of the property. Well, now you want to give one person in the room is going to get 33 boxes. They're going to get 1/3 of all the chocolate in the room. That means the rest of the 99 in the room will have to divide up 66 boxes in the room. But everybody else has less than one box, but this one person has 33 boxes. The 10%, was it say 10% owns 77% of the wealth. So that 1% is pretty wealthy, but now we're going to take 10 people, right? 10 people in the room, and we're going to give them 77 boxes. That means we have 23 boxes for the rest of us. That means the rest, the 90 of us, 90% of us only have 23 boxes because those 10 people over there, but remember, there's one person over there that has 33 boxes, right? Another way that's illustrated in your textbook, and I don't, I'm trying to come up with different ways to sort of illustrate this, is that if you take blocks, like building blocks, and each block represents $500 and you stack them on top of each other, I think it's the wealthiest person in the world, it's going to go all the way up to the top of Mount Everest. But most of us are only going to have 12 feet worth of blocks. So while that person's wealth goes all the way up to Mount Everest, we're all going to have only 12 feet. And the question, I get, like I said, I can get kind of ahead of myself. The average income, what does it say? The average income of the highest paid CEO earns 3,000 times what the average US worker. And this is minus all their perks, minus their jet, their clothing allowance, their car allowance, all of these things. Now, there's different ways to think about this, right? In the previous chapter, we talked about functional theory. To have a gap, to have your CEO make more money, that makes sense. But what social sciences are questioning is 3,000 times, 1,300 hours to make the same hourly wage as the people at the bottom? What if the people at the bottom didn't do their job? What if those minimum wage workers didn't come in to stand at the register and to sweep the floors, right? What the functional theory questions is this really functional? Is that person, is that highest paid CEO really that much more valuable than everybody else? One other way to sort of think about this, and this is an interesting one. Assuming you started working full time the year that Jesus was born. The year that Jesus was born, you started making the average, the per capita. Per capita is all the wealth in the United States divided up by people. If we take all the wealth and you divide it up by people and evenly distribute it amongst everybody in the United States, including children, there would be $47,000 approximately per year. The year that Jesus is born, you start making $47,000 per year up until today. In order for you to make the equal compensation of this guy named Mark Lohr of Walmart, you would have to work another 3,000 years, right? So again, the question is not that the CEOs make more money. The question is, that much more money? Isn't that a bit absurd? Or that's an awful lot. It's an awfully big difference. And is that really functional? I'm going to stop there.